The day Corbin Welles spent his last $40 on a water-damaged lockbox, the whole pawn shop laughed at him. Not a polite kind of laugh. Not the kind people swallow out of politeness. The man behind the counter, Dale Pruitt, whose family had run Pruitt's Pawn and Trade on Meridian Street for 3 generations, leaned over the glass case and let it out like he'd been saving it. And the 2 men flipping through guitar cases near the window joined in without even knowing what was funny, the way people do when they sense permission. "Son," Dale said, sliding the lockbox across the counter toward Corbin. "That thing came out of a flooded storage unit. We can't even get it open. There's nothing in it worth $40. Corbin tucked it under his arm anyway. He was 22 years old, standing in a pawn shop in Decatur, Georgia, with $40 to his name and a feeling he couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't grown up the way he had. He'd grown up knowing his father had owned something. Something small, something the family never got to see, because Robert Welles had died before he could hand it over, drowned in his truck. When the Lower Creek Road flooded 9 years ago, the summer Corbin was 13. His grandmother, May, had told him about the box maybe 100 times. A metal lockbox, painted dark green, about the size of a shoebox. Robert had kept it in a storage unit off Route 9 because the apartment they lived in didn't feel safe enough for whatever was inside. The storage unit had flooded the same year Robert died. May had gone to collect what she could, but the unit manager, a man named Gus Farrell, who Corbin would later learn had a habit of quietly absorbing the contents of abandoned units, told her everything was destroyed, that there was nothing worth taking. 9 years later, a water-damaged lockbox, painted dark green, had turned up at Pruitt's Pawn and Trade. Corbin had walked past the shop 3 times before he went in. He told himself he was being irrational. He told himself it was probably a coincidence. There were probably thousands of dark green lockboxes in Georgia. He went in anyway. He stood in front of the case for a long time. Dale Pruitt watched him from across the shop with the expression of a man who had seen many people stand in front of many things they couldn't afford. "Where'd it come from?" Corbin asked. Dale shrugged. "Estate lot. Bought a whole unit at auction. Came with the box. Whose unit? Don't know. Don't always know. Where was the unit?" Dale looked at him more carefully now. "Route 9 facility. Out past the bypass." Corbin didn't say anything for a moment. He felt the kind of stillness that comes right before something either confirms your whole life or makes you feel like a fool. "I'll give you $40 for it," he said. Dale blinked. "It doesn't open. I know. We can't guarantee there's anything inside. I know that too." Dale shook his head and called to the 2 men by the guitar cases. "Y'all hear this?" And they laughed, and Dale laughed. And Corbin paid his $40 and walked out into the August heat with the box under his arm, and sweat already collecting at the back of his neck. He didn't look back. Corbin Welles had not had an easy life, but he would have bristled at anyone who called it tragic. He had May, which was more than most people had. She was 71 years old and ran her household like a small government. Everything had a system. Everyone had a role, and dinner was at 6:30 whether you were happy about it or not. After Robert died, May had taken Corbin in without ceremony. She didn't sit him down and make promises. She didn't cry in front of him, at least not that first week. She just made room in the second bedroom, started packing his lunch, and told the school he'd be riding the bus from her address from now on. That was May. She didn't perform love. She just built the structure of it around you while you weren't looking. She had loved Robert, her only son, in the same quiet and structural way, and she had never fully believed the story about the flood. "Your daddy knew things," she told Corbin more than once, in the particular tone she used for statements she considered facts rather than opinions. He knew how that town worked. He knew who was skimming from the development contracts. He knew who had helped themselves to what didn't belong to them. And he had proof. "He told me so." "Then why didn't he go to anyone?" Corbin had asked her, when he was old enough to understand what that meant. May had looked at him with an expression that was equal parts sadness and something harder, because he was trying to do it the right way. He didn't want to hand over something that could get dismissed or buried. He wanted it airtight. She pressed her lips together. He ran out of time. Corbin had grown up carrying that the way some kids carry religion, not as something they could prove, but as something that organized everything else. His father had known something. His father had been careful. His father had died before the careful plan was complete. He was not going to let the careful plan die with him. The problem was that for 9 years, there was nothing to go on. The storage unit had been cleared. Gus Farrell had retired and moved to Florida. The men Robert had suspected. Corbin knew some of their names from May's occasional, careful mentions. Had continued on in Decatur without consequence. One of them now a county commissioner, another running a construction company, with more contracts than Corbin could count on both hands. And then a water-damaged lockbox had turned up at Pruitt's Pawn and Trade, and Corbin Welles had spent his last $40 on it, and walked home in the August heat trying to keep his hands steady. May was in the kitchen when he got back. She looked at the box and then looked at his face, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. "Where?" she finally said. "Pruitt's. Off Meridian." She wiped her hands on a dish towel. She crossed the kitchen and picked up the box and held it the way you hold something that belonged to someone you loved. Carefully, like the weight of it is more than its weight. "The clasp is rusted shut," she said. "I know." She looked at him again. She set the box on the kitchen table. "Then we're going to need to be careful about how we open it." He loved her for saying we. He had learned certain things in his early 20s that he hadn't expected to learn. Skills that came from necessity rather than interest, the way most real skills do. After high school, he'd worked 2 years at a locksmith and security company called Trident Lock and Key. Not because he had a passion for locks, but because they'd hired him, and because he'd discovered he was good at it, and because being good at something had a gravity to it that pulled you further in whether you meant to go or not. He'd left Trident 18 months ago to take a job with a small investigative firm run by a woman named Patricia Osei. Document research, mostly with some field work, but the lock knowledge didn't leave you. It settled into your hands the way any physical skill does. He set the box on the kitchen table under the overhead light and looked at it for a while before he touched it. The green paint had mostly bubbled and flaked. The metal was pitted with rust in places, though the damage was concentrated around the edges and hinges rather than the body, which suggested it had been waterlogged but not immersed for a sustained period. The lock mechanism was a simple pin tumbler, integrated into the clasp. He could see that the clasp itself had swollen and warped from moisture, which was probably what had stumped Dale Pruitt's efforts more than the lock itself. He got his tools. He had a small case he kept in the hall closet, not a professional kit, just the things he'd held on to from the Trident days. He sat down at the table and started working. May sat across from him and didn't speak. She had her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the box, and she had the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time. The clasp was the first problem. He worked a thin, flat bar along the seam where it had swollen and applied slow, even pressure. Not trying to force it, just trying to introduce a little space to remind the metal that movement was possible. He worked at it for 20 minutes. May got up once and made coffee and brought him a cup without him asking. The clasp shifted. It didn't open, just moved. A millimeter of give, maybe less, but it was enough to tell him the direction. He kept working. An hour and 15 minutes after he'd sat down, the clasp released with a sound like a small crack, and the lid came free. May made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Inside the box, wrapped in a layer of plastic sheeting that had mostly done its job, were papers, a small notebook with a dark blue cover, a folded document that looked like a contract, photographs printed on standard paper, the kind you'd run off a home printer, slightly wavy at the edges from moisture but legible, a USB drive in a Ziploc bag, and at the bottom, a handwritten letter, 2 pages. In handwriting, Corbin recognized the way you recognize something you've been looking for without knowing quite what it would look like when you found it. He'd seen his father's handwriting on 2 things his whole life: a birthday card May had kept, and a grocery list that had been tucked into a coat pocket and gone through the wash and was barely readable anymore. He recognized it anyway. Some things you just know. May had her hand over her mouth. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The letter came first, because that's where Corbin made himself start. Robert Welles had written it in careful, even script, the kind of handwriting that showed you the person had thought about what they were going to say before they put pen to paper. It was dated June 14th, 9 years ago, 6 weeks before he died. If you're reading this, it began, then I didn't get to do what I was planning to do, and I'm sorry for that. Corbin had to stop there for a moment. He kept reading. Robert wrote that he had been documenting for the better part of 2 years a pattern of bid rigging and contract fraud in Decatur's municipal infrastructure projects. The scheme was not complicated, but it was well protected by the fact that the people involved in it were also the people who would theoretically be responsible for investigating it. A cluster of 4 men, Robert named them, had for years been manipulating the bidding process for city contracts, routing work to shell companies they controlled, and splitting the proceeds. The amounts were not small. Over the period Robert had documented, the fraud totaled somewhere north of $2 million. One of the men was named Walter Grimes. He was, at the time Robert wrote the letter, a mid-level administrator in the county public works office. He was now, Corbin knew, a county commissioner. One was named Phil Casson, who now ran Casson Construction, the largest private contractor in the county. Robert wrote that he had the documents, the photographs, the financial records, everything. He had been planning to take it to a federal contact, bypassing the local apparatus entirely because he had no confidence in the local apparatus. He had an appointment scheduled. He was waiting until he had one more piece of the picture locked down before he went. He wrote, "I know this feels like a lot to leave behind if something happens. I know May is going to be angry with me for not telling her more. Tell her I was trying to protect her from having to carry it." He wrote, "To Corbin, you're going to be fine. You always find your way. Don't let anyone make you small." Corbin folded the letter along its original creases and set it down on the table and put his hands flat on his knees and breathed. May was crying. She was doing it quietly, with great dignity, the way she did everything, but her shoulders were shaking and she wasn't trying to stop it. He got up and went around the table and put his arms around her and stayed there until the shaking slowed. "He knew," she said. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "He knew something might happen. He knew it was a risk," Corbin said. "He tried to be careful. He should have told me. I know. He should have." She stopped. She pulled back and looked at Corbin with eyes that were wet but clear. "Okay," she said. "What do we do now?" What they did not do was go straight to anyone. Corbin had learned enough, both from his time at Trident and from his work at Patricia Osie's firm, to understand that what you had and what you could prove were sometimes different things, and that how you handled the gap between them mattered enormously. He called Patricia Osie that evening. He told her what he had without specifics and asked if she could meet. She said yes, tomorrow morning. Bring everything. Patricia Osie had been doing investigative document work for 14 years. She was in her mid-50s, carried herself with the energy of someone 20 years younger, and had the particular gift of listening to you describe a complex situation and immediately identifying the 2 or 3 things you needed to figure out before anything else could happen. She had hired Corbin because she'd needed someone who could do physical field work and was careful with information. And he had stayed because working with her was one of the few professional experiences he'd had that made him feel like his brain was being used at full capacity. He spread everything from the lockbox on her conference table. She looked at it for a long time without touching anything. Then she put on gloves and started going through the documents methodically. She didn't speak for almost 20 minutes. "The USB drive might be the key," she said finally. "If the files are intact." They weren't all intact. The drive had suffered some water damage despite the Ziploc bag. But a data recovery service Patricia knew, she called in a favor, was able to pull roughly 70% of the contents. That 70% included scanned financial records, internal emails, and photographs of documents that bore the signatures of Walter Grimes and Phil Casson and 2 other men. It was not everything Robert Welles had gathered, but it was enough. "Enough for what?" Corbin asked. Patricia looked at him steadily. "Enough for a federal referral," If we do this right. If we do this right was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. Doing it right meant documentation, authentication, legal counsel, the kind of procedural care that Robert had been trying to apply when he ran out of time. It meant not going to the county. It meant going to someone whose jurisdiction existed specifically outside the reach of the people implicated. Corbin Welles was 22 years old. He had $40 in his bank account, or had before he'd spent it at Pruitt's. He had a job at a small investigative firm. He had a grandmother who had been waiting 9 years for something to be done. He had his father's careful, ruined, recovered work. He had enough. It took 8 months. 8 months of working with Patricia and the attorney she brought in, a woman named Sandra Hollis, who specialized in whistleblower cases and public corruption, and who did not waste time on preamble. 8 months of affidavits and authentication, and careful, painstaking translation of Robert's notes into a format that federal investigators could use. 8 months of Corbin going to work and coming home, and sitting at May's kitchen table, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning, cross-referencing documents and double-checking timelines, and learning more about municipal procurement fraud than he had ever wanted to know. May brought him coffee and did not tell him to go to bed. She understood, without needing to say it, that this was the kind of work you had to see through. 8 months after Corbin Welles spent his last $40 on a water-damaged lockbox at Pruitt's Pawn and Trade, federal investigators executed search warrants on the offices and personal records of Walter Grimes, Phil Casson, and 2 associates. Corbin wasn't there for that. He heard about it from Patricia, who called him at 7:30 in the morning on a Thursday while he was eating cereal at May's kitchen table. He sat there with the phone against his ear and the cereal getting soft in the bowl and watched May's face as he told her what Patricia was saying. May sat down slowly. "Is it real?" she asked when he hung up. "It's real." She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them for a long time. "Your father would have." She stopped. Started again. "He would have wanted to see this, I know. He worked so hard. He did, and then you." She looked up. Her eyes were dry this time, but the expression in them was the kind of thing you don't fully have a word for. Grief and pride tangled together so thoroughly they'd become something new. "You didn't stop either." Corbin didn't say anything. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. Outside, the morning was doing what August mornings in Georgia do. Already promising heat. The sky a particular shade of blue that meant the day was going to be long and bright and probably humid enough to make breathing feel like an effort. An ordinary Thursday. The street looked the same as it always looked, but something had shifted. Something that had been waiting 9 years had finally moved. Walter Grimes resigned from his position as county commissioner 2 weeks after the search warrants were executed. He did it in a statement that used the phrase "to spend more time with my family" and did not mention federal investigators. Phil Casson's construction company was suspended from bidding on public contracts, pending the outcome of the investigation. Both men, along with their 2 associates, were ultimately indicted on charges that included wire fraud, bid rigging, and conspiracy. Corbin followed the legal proceedings the way you follow something when you've been inside the machinery of it, with attention to the procedural details that most people glaze over, and with a particular awareness of how long these things take and how many ways they can stall. He was patient. He had learned patience from his father's example, and from May's, and from the particular quality of attention you develop when you've spent months rebuilding a case from damaged paper and half-corrupted files. He was still working with Patricia when the first plea agreement was reached. He was still working with her when the second one came through and when the third did. At some point in the middle of all of it, Dale Pruitt came into Pruitt's Pawn and Trade one afternoon to find Corbin standing at the counter. Not shopping, just there. "I wanted to let you know," Corbin said, "that there was something in the box." Dale looked at him for a long moment. He was a big man, Dale Pruitt, with the kind of face that defaulted to skepticism not because he was as mean, but because the pawn business trained you to be. He didn't look mean right now. He looked something closer to careful. "I heard your name," Dale said, "in connection with the Grimes situation. Yeah. Dale was quiet for a moment. That box came from the Route 9 unit? Yes. Another pause. I didn't know what I had. No, Corbin said. You didn't, neither did the man who had it before you. That's kind of the whole point. He didn't say it with heat. He wasn't there to make Dale Pruitt feel bad. He wasn't even sure later why he'd stopped in at all, except maybe because he needed the story to have a moment like this, a place where it's circled back to its beginning and let him look at it clearly. The pawn shop, the glass case, the men laughing by the guitar cases, the $40. The thing about being laughed at is that it goes into you somewhere and sits there. Even when you win, even when everything you believe turns out to be true, the laughter doesn't unhappen. You just have to build enough of something else that the laughter gets small by comparison. Dale Pruitt cleared his throat. I'm glad you. He stopped, tried again. Good for you, son. Corbin nodded once. He walked back out onto Meridian Street and into the heat. May kept the letter. Not in a frame the way some families might have done it, not displayed. She kept it in the kitchen drawer where she kept the things that mattered most to her. The copy of her marriage certificate, a photograph of her mother, a birthday card Corbin had made her by hand when he was 8 years old, in crooked marker letters on a folded piece of notebook paper. Robert's letter went in the drawer and stayed there. Corbin asked her once if that was the right place for it. It's exactly the right place, she said. It belongs with the rest of the things that are true. He thought about that for a long time afterward. The rest of the things that are true. He thought about what it meant to keep things. Not as trophies, not as proof that you were right, but as evidence of the continuity of something. His father had worked carefully toward a truth and hadn't gotten to deliver it. Corbin had picked it up 9 years later, from under a layer of rust and flood damage and a pawn shop full of people who thought they knew what something was worth. The truth had waited. It had been patient in the way that only things that are true can afford to be. There are people in every town who assume they know the full measure of what's around them, who look at a young man with $40 and an inherited belief and see exactly what they expect to see. Someone who doesn't know what he's doing, someone to laugh at, someone who will walk back out into the heat and be forgotten by afternoon. And sometimes those people are right. The world is full of $40 mistakes made in pawn shops. But sometimes the person walking out into the heat knows something the room doesn't. Sometimes the thing that looks worthless is the only thing in the building that was ever worth anything at all. And sometimes the careful work of a man who didn't make it gets carried the rest of the way by someone who loved him. Robert Welles started something. Corbin Welles finished it. That's not a small thing. Don't let anyone tell you it is.